I went to a Division III school.
Okay, everybody.
Oh, no, we're not muted anymore.
Hello, Carol and company. Can you maybe mute your phone unless somebody's talking, because there's a lot of background noise, and thank you. That way I don't have to mute you if you guys want to say something. So, okay. Well, before the meeting officially kicks off here, I just want to do a few disclaimers and housekeeping items. So I'm Kim Piper, and I'm the Executive Officer for the Center for Congenital and Inherited Disorders at the Department of Public Health, and I have administrative oversight for the programs. This is being recorded. This meeting is being recorded. I started the recording just a second ago. So if any of you have any problems with that, I guess you can sign off the call. We do need to record it. It is an open meeting and anybody can participate. So I want to be sure that I'm able to post the recording for others to look at later on. So if you need to mute yourself, you can do that on your phone. If I need to mute you, I will do that. So I guess with that, we will get started, and Bobby Buckner-Binns will go ahead and kick it off.
Sure. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everyone, for rearranging your schedule to join the call today. We wanted to do this in advance of our upcoming Cidac meeting so that we could get kind of an in-depth discussion and overview of the SMA presentation from the subcommittee. I think we will start out with a roll call. So Kim, if you wouldn't mind going through each and making sure that we have well, actually, we probably don't need a quorum today, but just seeing all who we have on the call.
Yep, thanks. Sandra Dack Hirsch. Stuart Boulis. Was that you, Sandy? I'm not hearing you if that's you. Thanks. George Waby.
Yes.
Kim Von Ossen.
Here.
Lori Murphy Stokes.
I'm here.
Andrea Greiner. Val Sheffield.
Here.
Dan Rowley. Bobby Buckner-Binns.
Here.
Nate Noble. Senator Reagan. Representative Wessel Crochelle. Tom Schultz. Kelly Schulte. Kelsey Baker. Corey Inslee.
Here.
Kathleen Cady. Becky Luchin Gardner. Carrie Atkinson. Carrie Burnett. Amanda Devereaux.
I'm here.
Hello. Hannah Bombi.
Here.
Christina Trout.
Here.
Stacey Fralin. Representative Henson. Stan Burbrick.
Here.
Francis Dignan.
Here.
Paul Remedy.
Here.
Hello. That's for the members. And then we'll see who else is on the call. Carol, if you guys want to start at your shop, unmute yourselves and.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh. Hi, this is everybody in the university hospitals. So here we have Lisa Neff-Letts, Emily Phillips, Natalie Denler, Dr. John Burnett, Jenny Marcy, Cheryl Stimpson, Judy Miller, Lily Howard, Jacqueline Kotlarek, and me, Carol Johnson. I think that's,
Kathy.
oh, Kathy, oh, sorry. I was thinking you were introduced before. And I'm sorry, Dr. Matthews, Dr. Kathy Matthews, sorry. And Dr. Perlman is on his way. Sorry, Kathy. I was thinking you were introduced before.
Okay, and do we want to start out in the other folks that have joined us, other guests that are on the call?
I'm Sarah Turnbull. I'm a parent.
Kelly Schulte,
Welcome.
with the National Social Workers Organization.
Okay.
Krista Adams dialed in. I'm a parent.
Welcome.
Hi, Travis Henry from the State Hygienic Laboratory.
I am Megan Ramirez. I'm a parent.
Welcome.
Ashley
Hi,
Coleman, State Hygienic Lab.
Hi, Ashley.
And this is Kate Siegel with Biogen. I do government affairs for the state of Iowa.
This is Dan Wolf, medical science liaison from Biogen.
Carolyn Jones, Public Policy Government Affairs, Biogen.
Okay. Senator Segabart, are you on the call?
I'm not on the call. I'm on the computer.
Okay. Alrighty. I thought I saw you on there. So yep.
Oh, well, great. I didn't sure whether you could hear me or not. I can't seem to turn on my camera, so I don't think you can see me either. Can you?
Okay. Nope, that's fine. If it's okay with you, it's okay with us.
That's fine. I can hear you fine. I can see everything you're doing fine. So.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining us. Is there anybody whose name I did not call or did not have a chance to identify yourselves before we get started?
This is Mike Pantella from the State Hygienic Laboratory.
Hi, Mike. Okay, there will probably be some that are joining us a little bit late that I heard from them, but we can go ahead and get started.
This is Bobby again. Let's turn the presentation over to Jenny Marcy and team for the SMA presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't have the slides up. Do you have those?
Yep, I'm getting them up right now.
Okay. Because I can't do it by memory.
Yeah. Okay, can everybody see the slides up there?
We can.
Okay, yes. Great. Okay, just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Okay. So you can go ahead and go to the next one. I'm just going to start with the basics about SMA, and then go through some of the information that we discussed and reviewed in our subcommittee meetings before we voted. So spinal muscular atrophy is a genetic and inherited condition that leads to loss of motor neurons, and this causes proximal weakness and muscle atrophy. It is the most common genetic cause of death in early childhood. Go ahead to the next one. SMA is inherited in the autosomal recessive pattern, which is very similar to many of the other conditions on newborn screening, meaning you can be an unaffected carrier, and two carriers together have a 1 in 4 chance to have a child with the condition with each pregnancy. The rate of carriers in the population here in the US has been estimated at about 1 in 54, so about 2% of people are these asymptomatic carriers. And it's also been reported that about 2% of the mutations that can cause SMA are actually brand new in the baby or in the affected person and not necessarily inherited from a parent. So this all comes out to an incidence around 1 in 12,000 births. And most of the cases of SMA are caused by deletions of the SMN1 gene on both copies. So there's a kind of a common deletion mutation that accounts for the vast majority of cases. Then there's this estimated 2 to 5% that have one of these common deletion mutations on one copy, and then a point mutation or a small within the gene on the other. And there's only been a couple reports of individuals with SMA that do not have any deletions. Go to the next slide. So the SMA is caused by deletions or impairment of the SMN1 gene, but the SMN2 gene also plays a role in this condition. It modifies what we're seeing as far as the clinical picture, and it's located kind of just next door to the SMN1 gene on the same chromosome. It is in large part a copy of the SMN1 gene, but has a very important difference that causes it to only produce about 10% active protein compared to the SMN1 gene. And we can have, there's quite a bit of variation in the number of SMN2 copies that are found in a person. So some people, there's reports of people with 0 copies of SMN2 up to 5 copies, but usually 0 to 3. Next slide. This is just a little diagram of the 2 genes, SMN1 in yellow, SMN2 in blue, and SMN1, when it's there and working, creates a full-length protein that protects these motor neurons. And SMN2, most of the time, creates the protein that's lacking exon 7, or kind of that chapter of the gene. And that is destroyed by the cell and not used at all, not useful. And then only about 20%, this says 20%, sometimes it's 10%, it's an estimate, but a smaller percentage of full-length usable for the cells. Next slide. So the top table here is just the background of how SMA has been subtyped or classified based on the onset of symptoms and the kind of achievement of motor milestones. So SMA 0 is it usually has prenatal onset of symptoms and is kind of a worst case scenario. SMA 1 is onset of symptoms less than 6 months with a life expectancy less than 2 years. SMN2 onset's a little bit later, but still in infancy to early childhood. And then SMN3 and 4 are less severe and later onset. And the number of, the bottom table is just showing that the number of SMN2 genes is correlated with the kind of classification that person will meet when they get diagnosed. So with only 1 copy of SMN2, most of the time that would be type 1 SMA. 2 copies can be type 1, and the more copies you have, the more copies of SMN2 you have, the more likely you're going to have type 3 or type 4. But it's not a perfect correlation. Next slide. So this is just to show kind of what the expected or what the reported incidence of the subtypes are. So by far the most common type of SMA that's diagnosed is type 1, which is that onset less than 6 months. And then the next most common one is type 2, which has onset between 6 and 18 months. So this is primarily a early childhood infant onset condition. And the type 0 and type 4 are rare in general. Next slide. So historically, treatment of SMA was supportive care. So infants end up needing respiratory assistance, so ventilator dependent, and there wasn't a lot that clinically we could do to help them or extend life expectancy. But this new drug was developed specifically for SMA called nusinersen, and it got FDA approval back in 2016. This is it's classified as an antisense oligonucleotide, and I do have a slide in a minute to help explain what that is. And it was designed to actually target the SMN2 genes that are still there, and to try to get them to increase the amount of full-length protein they're producing from that 10 to 20%, so that we can get a higher amount of working protein produced and kind of fill in for the fact that the SMA1 or SMN1 genes are not there. It's delivered by lumbar puncture, and it is the typical schedule is to start with 4 loading doses in the first 2 months, and then maintenance is 1 dose every 4 months, and the price is $125,000 for each of those treatments. Next slide. So this is just kind of a study that looked at type 1 SMA, so again, the earlier onset, less than 6 months old, and the graph on the right shows that the infants that received the nusinersen had better overall outcome throughout the study than the control infants. Next slide. And this is from curesma.org. It's just kind of a glimpse at the fact that nusinersen is currently the only FDA-approved treatment for SMA, but there's a lot of active research going on looking at similar therapies and other therapies to treat SMA. So there's hope for other additional treatments kind of coming forward here. Next slide.
Can I interrupt with a question? Can I interrupt with a question?
Sure.
It seems like these studies are not real long yet. So do we have a sense of how long into the lifespan this therapy actually lasts? I mean, will it help them for the rest of their lives, or will it, or could it taper off and they could end up, or will just delay the onset symptoms?
Based on the biology of what this is doing, it's continuing to, what you need is SMN for the anterior horn cells or motor neurons to thrive. And as long as you have SMN, like everybody in the room I'm sitting in has, then your anterior horn cells live unless you develop some other disease later in life. So the fact that we are replacing that protein or increasing that missing protein means that we expect that you will continue to be able to maintain those anterior horn cells, and there's no reason to think that the drug would suddenly fail. Now, the question is, are we getting increased the amount of SMN up to 50% to match what a carrier has? And you know that a carrier makes 50% and has no symptoms. So if we're getting close to 40 to 50% with the drug, then we would expect the patient to have no further symptoms as long as they are getting the drug. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
But we don't have 20 years of follow-up with this drug since it was relatively recently started to be used. Nobody has reported a wearing off effect.
And just to explain, that was Kathy Matthews answering the question, as she's much better capable of doing that than I am. All right.
Oh, and can folks identify themselves when they talk?
Sorry.
That would probably help us all. Thank you. And Dr. Dickman, was that you?
Francis is asking the question.
Thanks.
I would love to be able to answer that question that well, but I can't. All right, next slide. All right, so this slide is just kind of showing some of the mechanisms for how these different treatments are working. So on the right, there's a couple of different ways that you can manipulate the SMN2 gene in order to increase its production of full-length functional protein. So one of these is an antisense oligonucleotide like nusinersen, which is the one listed on the top. And so it's designed to just kind of change the way the cell is processing the copy of the information that's coming off of the gene so that we're not dropping off that exon 7. And the other way that is being investigated is through these splice switching small molecules. And then on the left side of the diagram is showing that if you are missing the SMN1 gene, which is the big red X, by using a gene therapy, you can kind of basically replace that and create full-length functional SMN protein if you can replace the gene therapeutically. So that would be, right now, Avexis 101 is a one-time IV treatment that is in clinical studies. I think the next slide shows, if you want to switch to that one. Yeah, so we've got FDA approval for one. These other things are in clinical trials. Next slide. All right, so as far as the timeline for SMA and newborn screening, it was actually initially presented or nominated to the Federal Advisory Committee back in 2008, at which point they declined to do a formal evidence review and recommended prospective pilot studies. Then in the interim, nusinersen was further developed and tested and approved by FDA. And then in 2017, the Federal Advisory Committee accepted the proposal and started an evidence review process. On February 8th of this year, that advisory committee voted to recommend that the secretary add SMA to the Recommended Uniform Screening Panel, or RUSP. And then on July 2nd, Secretary Azar accepted that recommendation and added SMA on the national level to the recommended panel. Next slide. So this is just kind of some of the key points from the advisory committee's evidence review. They looked at literature from 2000 through June of 2017, and then had an update in January of 2018. And 4 of 7 of the key treatment and screening articles were published during this time. And quite a few of the background articles were published after November 2017. So there's been a lot of new information coming out very quickly about this. They also included what they termed gray literature or conference presentations. So this is information that was available but not yet published in a peer-reviewed journal, but available through other sources like presentations or posters at meetings, things like that. Next slide. All right, so this was just, they included this study on the gene replacement therapy that was being studied, just to show that that treatment is also looking promising and showing increased motor function. So the CHOP Intend score is a measure of motor function, a standard measure that they use, and you can see on the right was infants, and I don't remember what the one on the left was. I think it was a smaller dose. But on the right, you can see that most of these infants had significant improvement with that gene replacement. The next slide. So these were the studies that they reviewed and discussed that were specific to the nusinersen. So I had trouble keeping all of these cute names like Cherish and Endear and Nurture and Embrace and Shine straight. I tried to make this slide so that I could have something to refer back to. So basically, this is just to show that the studies that have been done, some have been phase 2, some have been phase 3, some have been infantile onset, others later onset. Nurture is the one that is the pre-symptomatic SMA cases that were treated, so the most similar to what we'd be looking at if we were doing newborn screening for SMA. Next slide. Okay. So the Endear study looked at the infantile onset, the type 1 SMA. They had to be 7 months or younger to be included, but they were not pre-symptomatic. So these were babies that were diagnosed by symptoms. And they actually stopped this trial after 13 months because an unblinded monitor saw such a significant difference between the treated group and the sham treatment group that they felt it was unethical to proceed any further with the study. And the next slide actually shows the numbers, or kind of the improvement. So on the left side, you've got event-free survival. The treated group is in blue, and the control group is in black, and you can see that there's a big gap between the lines. And then the graph on the right is overall survival. So event-free survival means alive without use of permanent ventilation. So a significant difference in both the event-free survival and overall survival between the groups. Next slide. Okay, so the Nurture study, which again is the one most similar to what a newborn screening situation would be, was not completed or published before the time of the Federal Advisory Committee review. But they did reference several poster presentations of the data. These were infants diagnosed with SMA either because they'd had a sibling born, so the family knew there was a possibility of it, newborn screening in states doing that, or prenatal screening and testing. One presentation had 20 cases, another one had 9, and the early kind of thought coming out of this data was that the milestone development was better in those who got treatment earlier before they had symptoms than in those who were treated even, in that less than 7 months time frame from the other study. Next slide. So in February, when this was kind of discussed, there was a work group that had been developed, or a work group that was developing treatment guidelines specific to newborn screening. That group had submitted a manuscript which was under review at the time that the Federal Advisory Committee was meeting. It then was pre-published online in March and fully online in May, and that is the Glasscock et al. Article where they used expert consensus to recommend treating those diagnosed with SMA, so 2 copies of the SMN1 deletion, with either 2 or 3 copies of SMN2 at the time of diagnosis. And then it also laid out guidelines for how to monitor infants identified through newborn screening with, again, 2 deletions of SMN1, but with 4 or more copies of SMN2. Next slide. So this is just a screenshot of Secretary Azar's letter back to the committee saying, yes, I agree with your recommendation. And in the next slide, I just kind of blew it up a little. As with all of the conditions that have been added to the RUS, they put this statement in that it doesn't mean that states are required to include it or to start screening. It's a recommendation. And then on the next slide, what was different about the SMA, being added to the RUS was that the secretary asked that the committee provide back a report after 2 years describing the status of implementation for SMA, newborn screening, and clinical outcomes of early treatment and any potential harms for infants diagnosed. When other conditions have been added to the RUS, the secretary has not asked for this kind of feedback. Although this is a new secretary, we seem to go through them kind of quickly. All right, next slide. All right, so the panel management subcommittee for Cidac got together and used the criteria that had been previously set up. And this is just a review of going through kind of those points that, according to our policy, we're supposed to keep in mind, or we're supposed to use to evaluate conditions, and kind of the information that came out of our discussion. So the Wilson-Younger criteria are the historic newborn screening or population screening guidelines, and those are the blue lines. And if there was any kind of discussion about it, that's in purple. So it was agreed that SMA is an important health problem. The accepted treatment, there was some discussion about the amount of data available on pre-symptomatic patients and also regarding the cost of treatment that came up during this part of the discussion. There was agreement that yes, there are facilities for diagnosis and treatment. Yes, there's a recognizable latent early symptomatic stage for types 1, 2, 3, and 4. Is there a suitable test? Yes. Next slide. Acceptable screening for the population? Yes. Natural history of the condition understood? Yes, specifically for types 1, 2, and 3. And then an agreed policy on whom to treat? Yes, as the consensus paper had been published. Cost of case finding, including diagnosis and treatment, economically balanced. This did bring up a discussion about the cost of nusinersen and the long-term possible effects of treatment with lumbar puncture. And then is the case finding a continuing process? Yes, if it were added to newborn screening, it would be. Next slide. So then we turn to those slides were the Wilson-Younger criteria. Then we looked at the other criteria that have been set up in the policy for us to try to evaluate things for Iowa specifically. So our capacity to provide a suitable test, we got some feedback from lab members of the committee that said the CDC has developed a combination SCID SMA assay, which targets only the exon 7 deletions, which means that we could do the screening without detecting carriers. So we would have, going into it, approximately a 5% false negative rate. So we know we would miss, with this screening process, we would miss the 5% of infants with SMA who have a single deletion mutation and then a point mutation on the other gene. This screening does not detect SMN2 copy number, so we would not be able to, there would need to be more clinical testing on the back end for screen positive infants to determine who would be starting treatment or who would be followed for onset of symptoms or early signs of symptoms to start treatment. There was discussion about what would it take to include second tier SMN2 testing, copy number testing within the newborn screening laboratory, and we were informed it really wouldn't be cost effective because it would be additional molecular testing that would be done only on the cases where we had a single exon 7 deletion identified, and it would be more cost, it would be a better turnaround time and probably better for the individual cases to do that on the clinical end of things versus the newborn screening lab side of things. In general, just not a great use of the newborn screening lab staff and effort and money. All right, so the next criteria is, do we have facilities or expertise for diagnosis and treatment? The article recommends that the treatment be provided by a neuromuscular clinic, not just general pediatric neurology. So the University of Iowa is the only neuromuscular clinic in the state. Then we got some feedback from our clinical team that there are some clinics in surrounding states like Omaha, Nebraska, Gillette in Minnesota, Washington U, and Mercy, Kansas City down in Missouri. And right now, Illinois has maybe some limited services at Lurie Children's in Chicago. All right, so the potential impact on the existing newborn screening system, so kind of breaking out into the subgroup, what is newborn screening? So the state hygienic lab, it would be feasible to add SMA screening with existing lab space and minimal need for additional staffing. It would require additional money for, obviously for reagents and things, and to update the IT system. Short-term follow-up, expected, it would be feasible with the expected staffing of 5 short-term follow-up staff. In the meantime, because I did this presentation back a couple of months, we've lost one of our short-term follow-up nurses. We're currently trying to hire 2 to get us back up, or get us up to the 5 that we were hoping to have by now, but don't have yet. Long-term follow-up, as with other newborn screening programs, we don't really have a long-term follow-up tracking system, although the neuromuscular team at UIC would be available, willing, and able to be that long-term follow-up staffing and see the patients on the clinical side. We would need the health department to update the newborn screening brochure and would do all of the legwork for the legislative changes needed to increase newborn screening fee. The amount of that increase would need to be determined. We don't know exactly what it would be. And then program-wide, we would need to do education, marketing, talking to birthing facilities, PCPs, general public, as we do whenever we add a new condition. Next slide. So we talked about the financial feasibility. We had a discussion about how our developmental fund has been used in the past to fund pilot studies for new conditions. we also discussed that we weren't sure how another increase in the newborn screening fee would be viewed in light of the fact that we just recently had the committee vote to increase the current fee by $20, and that goes into effect next summer. And then this would be an increase on top of that. So we'd go up over that 150 that we haven't even started yet, which will be next July. We got some feedback from our clinical members that state insurance has been covering the nusinersen, including our medication program. And then there was general discussion about the overall cost to insurance, to the state, to society, that it's very hard to calculate, and it's not just the number value of the cost of the treatment, which is a lot, but what does that say in other treatments these infants would have been getting? If we're keeping kids with SMA from being on ventilators, that is obviously a decrease. If we're decreasing the number of hospitalizations or other treatments they're getting, that offsets the cost of that treatment. And the clinical team also pointed out that regardless of newborn screening, this treatment is being used and would be used. And so if we can get better benefit by doing newborn screening, that would be overall saving money to the system because we're already using the treatment. And then the things that are really hard to calculate in financial feasibility is what are the other costs? Do family members have to, stop working full-time or start working at all in order to provide care for infants with SMA if they're not treated or if they develop symptoms before they get treatment? What is that societal cost, not just in money to that family, but also in the loss of that productive member of society being part of the workforce, and the potential to add the patients who have SMA to the productive workforce potentially in the future. All right, next slide. So one of the things we're supposed to look for is has anybody made position statements either for or against newborn screening conditions? And SMA newborn screening has been widely supported by Cure SMA, the Child Neurology Foundation, MDA, and the SMA Foundation. No one in our subcommittee was aware of any groups officially opposed to newborn screening for SMA. And then the last criterion is to say, is there a public forum that is needed? And it was kind of a consensus that the public forum was not needed. And at this point in the discussion, there was a request to consider a consented pilot study, which has been something done in other states, considering adding new conditions to the newborn screen, but we've never done that here in Iowa. All right, so I tried to summarize kind of the big points in our discussion as what points were made that were in support of adding and what points were made as areas of concern or needing further discussion or investigation. So this slide is just the summary of the primary support. So a low false positive rate, can't get better than 0% false positive rate in published newborn screening trials. The ability to screen for SMA without detecting carriers was seen as a positive, especially since it was a relatively common condition compared to some of the other things we screen for, and this would detect approximately 700 carriers per year for SMA in our state. Another positive was that the majority of cases are infantile onset, not the later onset type. But when you're doing newborn screening, you want to get things affect newborns and not adults or older children. That we have the capacity in our program for adding SMA without requiring making major staffing or infrastructure changes. And then I cannot emphasize enough how excited our clinical team is about this treatment that is now available. You know, you guys are also animated about it, and it seems very exciting, and it's hard not to feel that from you. So we know there's a lot of excitement and joy surrounding treatment because it's been so long a condition that we didn't have really anything to offer. And then the fact that the treatment is currently being covered by both private insurance and Iowa Medicaid is a big plus. So the areas of concerns that were raised in the subcommittee are in the next slide. So the cost of treatment or insurance coverage to have healthcare equity, if somebody had an insurance that didn't cover it, that's pretty much out of the price range of most families I know. And we looked into, after our last meeting, we looked into the possibility of a cost-benefit analysis tool that we thought was available from another state program, but it really was something that was going to require hours of time and expertise, and it wasn't an easy plug in the numbers like we initially thought it might be, so that wasn't really available. There is limited data on pre-symptomatic treatment with nusinersen. So again, there were the 9 cases followed for a year, and a lot of that data was at the time published. Just the lack of long-term follow-up, the lack of a long-term follow-up system in our newborn screening program, and this is an issue for other conditions that we're already screening for, where we now know that we have some of the later onset types that are kind of lost, follow-up lost to, you know, knowing if newborn screening is making an impact on them in a positive or negative way. Either way, we don't know. The part of our discussion was the kind of uncertainty about whether or not our current funding model for newborn screening, which has served us very well in Iowa to date, will be sustainable for kind of the long line of conditions that are now being added to the RUSP that we're not yet screening for in Iowa, that each of these requires significant time and effort and money to implement, to make changes to the IT system, to sometimes an SMA, but for other disorders to add equipment or to add staff. And we don't we had this general discussion about this uncertainty about whether our funding system is sustainable in the long term, given the increased rate of conditions being added to the recommended uniform screening panel in recent history. Another area raised of concern was just the lack of consent process in the pilot programs that we've done for new conditions. This is a mandated screen, and adding something new, some members felt that a pilot should be a consented system instead of just added on to the panel, kind of in an informal way at first to kind of track it, and then full implementation later on. Unknown negative rate estimated at about 5 to 7%. I actually can't remember why I put that on there. It must have been, and I did these slides several months ago, and I've done a couple things in between. So, you know, we know that we're going to have a false negative rate because it's not, SMA is not only due to these deletions, but also our point mutations. So we know we're going to miss some. We think it's estimated at this range, but there really hasn't been anything published on what the actual rate is. with newborn screening. And just to point out that this would be the first condition that the screening method that we're doing would be a genomic test. That's a second tier. So even though we use molecular genetic testing in other newborn screening conditions in our lab, the initial screen for cystic fibrosis is actually it's an analyte. It's an immunoreactive trypsinogen. It is not genomic. It's not the person's actual DNA like a gene test is the way SMA is. And so it's a slightly different way of looking at screening because it really is the diagnostic test.
Question.
Yes.
Question. This is Senator Segabart. Would it require more than just a blood draw to do the test on, or is it doing a biopsy?
No. This would be very easily just included. We right now collect 5 blood spots on a filter paper card that are then clipped and tested in the state lab, and this would be, it would not require any additional sample beyond what we're already collecting now with a still stick and blood collection on the newborns.
If I'm
Great.
not, this is Dr. Seth Perlman, also with neuromuscular. It gets basically piggyback on top of T-cell assay that we currently do for SCID, right?
Right.
The methodology that would be for it. It could be, yeah.
But there is an available assay that would require very little changes on the lab end to implement this screening. Basically combining it with the screening for another condition we're already doing. All right. So then the next step was did an online vote of the subcommittee. And I sent an email out to committee members that had statements and asked people to vote, respond by email with yes, no, or maybe to the statement of Iowa should add SMA caused by homozygous deletion of exon 7 of the SMN1 gene to the panel of on newborn screening. And the next slide is the results. There was strong support for adding SMA to our state panel. 9 votes in favor, 2 voted against. There were no maybes. And then 3 people who were sent the email abstained from voting. One of those was myself. I felt like I needed to abstain to just keep myself neutral as I would be the one presenting to Cidac. And then 2 members that were not at we had 2 meetings, 2 members were not at the second meeting and they also abstained from voting. And with the vote, I asked that because we had quite a long and sometimes emotional discussion, I did ask that if people felt like they wanted something additional shared or added, that they could provide additional information with their vote. And this was just some of the information that was shared with that voting process. And so some of the comments included that certainty of benefit is lacking, and then a concern about does the pre-symptomatic detection, so newborn screening detection, provide improved outcomes over clinical detection, and does that vary by SMN2 copy number? So are we improving it more for infants with 3 copies of SMN2 versus only 2? And then also a concern about a plateau of motor milestones in cases with only 2 SMN2 copy numbers that was seen on one of those poster presentations. And then there was a comment about concerns about a risk of renal toxicity in the medication packet insert, which if you looked through the FDA information that was provided for this meeting, for today's meeting, the FDA kind of listed out the possible side effect or concerns, and renal toxicity was one of those. And then there was a recommendation from one member of the subcommittee to reconvene our subcommittee when additional data had been published from the Nurture trial, which is that pre-symptomatic infantile onset study. And then the other information that came with the voting is on the next slide. That the Pure SMA newsletter from spring highlighted the addition of the RESP, and it contained information about advocacy for adding SMA on the state on a state-by-state level for people involved with Cure SMA. And then I think the last slides are just the references and places I got the information, in case people wanted to check on that.
This is Kim. I'm going to interject here a little bit. We have some family members that need to leave the call pretty soon due to their day jobs. So if it's okay, Bobby, with you and the group, we'll move the public comments and testimony up to now, if that's all right with you.
I think that's fine with me, as long as that works. I think if everyone else is flexible, we were all probably planning on the full time, so let's go ahead and do that.
Okay, great. Megan, would you like to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
If you're ready for me, just want to first of all say thank you for the opportunity to speak on the behalf of my family and our SMA community. My name is Megan Ramirez, and my family is from LeClaire, Iowa. My husband and I have 3 daughters. They are 16, 13, and 12. Our youngest daughter, Madison, has spinal muscular atrophy type 3. We began looking for answers to her problems when she was an infant, when she was actually born a preemie, so Maddie was born at 30 weeks. And so we had kind of expected some delays in her large motor skills and things like that. So by the time she was about 18 months, she still was not walking, and we began looking for other answers. So we kind of thought it wasn't so much her being a preemie anymore, there had to be something else wrong. So we went looking for answers, and the first neurologist that we went to looking for answers had told us that she assumed Maddie had cerebral palsy and that she would probably be fine, and she was a little weak, but she would grow into herself and she would just probably walk funny or have some delays. After leaving that appointment, I was not happy with the outcome, and I decided I wanted to keep looking. And so again, we were kind of still in that limbo. We didn't know what her diagnosis was, but didn't agree with the doctor at that time. So we ended up at another hospital a few months later. So that took us a few more months. And the neurologist at that hospital thought that maybe she had SMA from some of the symptoms that we had mentioned to him. And they did do a genetic test, which took several weeks. And Maddie actually was not diagnosed with SMA until she was almost 2.5. She was about 28 months. So between the two doctors, it was about a 10-month delay before we actually got a diagnosis. Maddie was originally diagnosed at type 2, and we were told that she would never walk. And obviously that is horrific to hear. We were told that our daughter would probably die in her teen years, and there was nothing they could do. There was no cure. There was no treatment. And that was pretty devastating. But we kind of pushed through the devastation and the depression period, and we decided that we would push our daughter just like our older two and allow her to do anything and everything that she wanted to do. And Maddie did defy those odds, and she started walking at the age of 3.5. Now, Maddie could never really walk long distances, but she could navigate a room. She went to school, used a wheelchair for transportation, but that was about it. We never brought the wheelchair in her house. She didn't use it in her classroom or at school. She did walk. And things kind of seemed like they were always at a plateau, and we knew the nature of the disease, and we feared that one day she would lose that ability, and she would lose all of the strength that she fought so hard for. So now comes the hard part. When Maddie was about 9, we noticed that things were getting a lot harder for her as she grew. Her body was growing. We heard of medical trials, and we did everything we could to get some help for what seemed to be the scariest time in our life. It was kind of like watching a movie with a ticking time bomb, wondering if the people were going to escape in time. We constantly wondered when the day would come that Maddie would lose that ability and that strength that she fought so hard for. Sorry. We flew to New York and we tried to get into trials and we were denied. So we just waited and waited for treatments to be approved. In that time, a lot of our dreams were crushed. Maddie lost the ability to walk. Maddie was starting to lose the ability to raise her arms, to feed herself, to crawl, things that she'd always been able to do. At that same time, we were living in our dream home that we'd built, and I was pregnant with Maddie. Maddie was born, and we continued to build our house, and of course, it was a 2-story home with all our bedrooms on the top floor, the kids' playroom in the basement. And as Maddie grew, it became harder and harder for us to carry her up the stairs and down the stairs to play with her sisters. We dreamed of an accessible home where she could be free and independent. We finally had to sell our home where all of our family memories were made, and we moved into a small 2-bedroom condo that served as our next house. If you don't know, there aren't very many accessible homes on the market for young growing families, and so we decided we had to build a new house. We currently live in our new home that is accessible for Maddie, and it is very financially, it is a big financial struggle, I should say, to afford the house that we had to build. We had to add equipment and lifts and larger hallways and larger doors, things like that for a special needs handicapped child. Maddie grew and gained weight and unfortunately lost her ability to walk in November of 2010. I'm sorry, in November of 2016 at the age of 10. The fight for accessibility for Maddie has been ongoing. Most often it's twice a year since she was 3. And we feel that with newborn screening, all of these hardships and the expenses of the school would have been saved. We fight twice a year with IEP meetings for equipment. We have to fight insurance for new equipment as she grows. Had newborn screening been available when she was an infant, I don't think she would have lost that ability to crawl or to walk, I mean. My daughter's had nursing care since she was 3 years old. Medicaid has covered the cost of that. She just recently this summer had a spinal fusion and underwent an 8-hour surgery and a week in the ICU. She is now in the middle of recovery. She's about 10 weeks post-surgery and has had lots of special equipment, nurses, aides, physical therapists, occupational therapists that come several times a week, where all of this could have been avoided had she been treated pre-symptomatically or as an infant. My final points here are going to be talking about the organization Cure SMA. We've attended the Cure SMA conference the last 10 years, and I'll never forget the first year that we attended in Boston. The utter shock and fear that I felt as I watched mothers pushing their children around in beds where kids were trached and suctioned. They couldn't talk, swallow, or even smile. For those of you not knowing much about SMA, you can imagine what that might do to you. Or you might think about having your child never smile again, and I know some of these other parents can talk about that. With newborn screening, I've witnessed families who have multiple children with SMA at these conferences. Just this past summer, I was able to interact with a family whose youngest child was treated pre-symptomatically. She has no symptoms. Their middle child is a type 1, like their oldest brother. The oldest one is laid out in a bed, trached and suctioned. However, the 2-year-old is running and talking. To witness the science change the course of this disease is beyond amazing. This particular little boy is only one of hundreds that I have witnessed myself. The opportunity to administer a treatment as soon as possible makes newborn screening very critical. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Megan. Sarah, would you like to go next?
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Megan. I am Sarah Turnbull. My husband, Travis, and I have 3 children. Our oldest, we don't know if he's a carrier or not. Our second child, Stella, was born perfectly healthy, but she has SMA type 1. Our third child, we had a little surprise, had our third child, and he fortunately is not a carrier of the disease. Today I'm obviously going to focus on Stella, our second born. When she was born, she was perfectly 10 on the APGAR. She was actually doing things ahead of schedule. At 3 weeks of age, she was actually holding her head up. At 4 weeks of age, she was a rag doll. Literally, I went to give her a bath and her arms flailed, her head flailed. I called my husband immediately and said, there is something terribly wrong with her. Having had another child before her, I knew this was not normal. He said, "Oh, Sarah, it's probably fine." But I said, "No, children do not regress like this." We whisked her off to Mayo Clinic, where after a week of testing, very, muscle biopsy, the whole works, we were told that they had a 99% certainty that it was spinal muscular atrophy. So she was diagnosed at 1 month, but we waited for official results to come at 1.5 months. 1 month of age is a very young time to be diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy, and I'm here to say that we were one of the lucky ones. We were told to take her home and love her. There was absolutely nothing we could do. At that time, 11 years ago, we didn't go home with anything. We didn't go home with oxygen tank, pulse ox, anything. I can't tell you the number of times that we should have lost Stella. At 2 months of age, she quit breathing in her car seat, and I had to do CPR on her, and we were very fortunate. She came back without any mental issues. There were many times that were like that. I think the biggest key that I want to share is that early identification of SMA means early intervention, which means a better outcome for both the child and the family. This disease does not discriminate. This disease affects the child. It affects every family member. Early intervention for us would have meant that she wasn't $1 million baby. The cost of care for my child is incredible. From a $50,000 life flight to hospitalizations to a ventilator that costs $25,000, a G-tube, cough assist, a specialized motorized wheelchair that is her only source of independence because she can wiggle her fingers to drive it. That chair costs $30,000 alone. Her suction machine, her limited movement, and the fact that I am actually sitting in a public school system in case of emergency. I am no longer employed. I am a sub-associate at times. I'm a college-educated person that cannot work, and I thrive on being able to work. But here I am at school because I may not have a nurse that can take care of her because home care is very hard to find, especially good quality home care. All the good nurses seem to work in the hospital. The cost of this disability is staggering. We fortunately can handle being a single income family. I know many families struggling that cannot be a single income family. The cost of healthcare for us, the first 2 years of her life, because we were a middle class family, we had good primary insurance. My husband has a really great employer. Even those first 2 years before she was on the Medicaid waiver, the figures were astounding. The amount of money that we paid out in the first couple years was $20,000 to $30,000 for equipment that wasn't covered, for co-pays, hospitalizations, etc. Not only that, but there's also the cost of home and vehicle modifications. Yes, there are waiver programs out there. Not everything is always covered. My husband actually installed a lift in our van, so we did not have to wait the months to get it approved. Currently, I am fighting for a ceiling lift because my child is now 60 pounds and our nurses are not supposed to carry over 50. I've been fighting for a ceiling lift since February of this year. I think it's also important to note the mental health of the parents, not only the parents, but their siblings. My children should not have ever had to call 911 because their sister was not breathing and had to help us in that situation because we had to do CPR. The loss of sleep is taxing to my husband and I. I will not lie and say that it's definitely wearing on our marriage, although we're also stronger for the adversity. The inability to find nurses. I have 2 full-time nurses that are supposed to work. Again, it's difficult to find good nurses, so therefore I'm here at school in case that nurse is unable to perform or just simply does not show up, which seems to often be the case. Quality of life is the other thing that I would like to quickly just mention. My daughter's movement is limited to her fingers. She lost her smile, as Megan mentioned. That was the one thing I always prayed for, is that she would never lose her smile. And then she lost it at 3 years of age. She's been trached. She's had a spinal fusion. She's had multiple emergencies that in which we should have lost her. Her quality of life is still good, but it can be so much better. She is currently receiving Spinraza, and I should note she started receiving it a year ago, and since then she's moving more than her fingers. She's shaking her head. Her finger dexterity to control her wheelchair, which is the only form of independence that my child has because she relies on me for every other thing, has improved. She's now going up and down the hallways at school. She's her participating in PE. She is even playing in the 6th grade band. She is playing drums, using the switches on her chair, using finger movement. Her stamina to get through the school day is so much better. She's not falling asleep by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Her heart rate is more of a normalized heart rate. We were always very tachycardic, and she's now 10 to 15 points lower than what her normal heart rate was pre-Spinraza. Her vocal changes are amazing. I never imagined that the first couple of days of school, I would actually have to tell my child to be quiet in the classroom. So that was a new change this fall for us. So I know we are pushing newborn screening, but I also wanted to share a little bit about why it's important for all children because of Stella's fragility. And she's probably one of the most fragile SMA children living in the state. I'm pretty certain of that, actually. I know what a difference her life would look like. We have met so many families as well, like Megan had referenced, in which the older child is very much like my Stella, and their younger children are running around, sitting up at 5 months of age, which is even, early for a newborn. So early detection is the key so that then you can have early intervention and hopefully better quality of life for all. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. Krista, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Krista Adams. I'm the mother of a little girl named Ava. Ava was born in June of 2015. Just like Sarah had said, I mean, she was a perfectly healthy, full-term baby. Everything was perfect, and for just a very short amount of time, our lives were perfect. We had another almost 2-year-old healthy baby girl at home. When Ava was a month old, we saw some issues, but she actually was diagnosed with pyloric stenosis. Easy to fix. It was a one-day surgery. We went home, but then I guess kind of started our issues. About 3 months, when she was about 3 months old, I really started to notice delays, and she was just kind of wrote off as a lazy baby, and the pyloric stenosis maybe had taken a little bit of a toll on her. So mentioning that to doctors at her 3-month checkup, and also making a point to get her in for a 4-month checkup, because just as a mother, you have that intuition that something's not right. Our pediatrician kind of wrote it off and didn't take us seriously, and I finally switched to doctors, got a second opinion at almost 6 months. We live in western Iowa in a very rural community, so at that point, she wrote us a recommendation to be seen at Children's Hospital in Omaha with a neuromuscular specialist. It took 3 weeks to get into that appointment, and by the time, I think, just sitting talking with our doctor, SMA was on the top of our minds, and we had done a lot of research. Kind of everything kind of pointed in that direction, but as parents, we prayed that that wasn't going to be what the doctor said. We did tests about a week later, and it took 10 days to get those results back. When Ava was shortly over 7 months old, I think we missed the deadline by like 2 days. We did indeed learn that she had SMA. My husband and I had no idea we were carriers. Like I said, we had another perfectly healthy little girl at home. And, from that day out, everything just was a whirlwind. In a matter of weeks, we had medical equipment. We were told she couldn't go to a regular daycare. My husband's a farmer. we're the 5th generation on our family farm. So it's not like we can just pick up and move to somewhere that's more accessible to us with better healthcare, with better options for nursing and hospitals and medical facilities. So, and I work at our local bank. I carry the benefits for our family. So, staying with her was not an option either. We did pretty well with Ava. She had a couple of bouts, 3 life flights to Omaha, which you can imagine are not cheap. How many PICU stays? I think 4 or 5 nights at a time. And we finally did lose Ava in November of 2016. She came down with a respiratory illness, and it seemed like overnight it was terrible. We did what we could, but at that point, my husband and I had to make the choice what kind of life we wanted our daughter to have. So I pray no one ever has to make that choice, but we did lose Ava to a respiratory illness that for any other child maybe would have been a day home from school, but for us, it meant losing our child. If she would have been screened for SMA at birth, I mean, obviously we would probably still have our daughter at this time. Spinraza was not approved then. It was actually approved the day before Christmas, about a month and a half after my daughter passed away. So that was hard also. I guess to parents like me and people in a small community, the newborn screening really is a no-brain decision. Like I stressed, we live in such a rural community. A lot of our small town doctors, while they do take us seriously, they don't have the specialized knowledge that we needed. So every time there was an illness or an appointment, it was a complete day off of work for myself to travel 2 hours to Omaha and back. And I'm sure like any other SMA parent, having your child in a vehicle for 2 hours is nerve-wracking enough as it is. You pack up your life and you do that and you just pray to God. You get there and you get home in one piece. My husband's a farmer, so a couple of months out of the year, he really is, unavailable, and we didn't have the nursing. We were told if we wanted to hire private care nursing, they would have to come from Omaha or Des Moines, which were 2 hours away in either direction. Bless my sister, who is an LPN, more or less put her life on hold to stay with Ava, to be her caregiver, so I could stay at work and continue to have benefits for our family. We do have another child at home, and you have to think of what you need to do for all of your children. She needed to stay in daycare to be social with other children. We tried to keep life as normal as possible for the 10 months that we had to deal with SMA in our lives. Again, I mentioned too, every time there was an illness, it was an immediate lifeline to a larger hospital, long-term care. And like what Sarah said too, you pay out of pocket to make your house accessible, to keep everyone's lives as normal as possible for these children, because they have no cognitive disability. To them, they don't understand why they can't move their hands or participate with other children. So you try to just keep them thinking that life is normal and life is good. So newborn screening to me, I think would be so beneficial to change the lives of all those children, that they should never have to wonder, why am I not like the other children? Why can't I walk? Why can't I run? And since we've lost Ava, I've made it my mission to try to be an advocate for SMA, for newborn screening, for anything possible. We raise money for Cure SMA every year in June in honor of her birthday. And if there's anything I can do to help this, because I was naive enough to think I would just have healthy babies, and newborn screening really didn't even cross my mind until, you go through something like SMA. So I guess just asking for consideration and empathy for the children and their families and their siblings and everyone else involved. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kristen. Is there anyone else from the public who would like to provide comment? Okay, thank you very much, and I truly respect you guys for attending the meeting today and for speaking up. Thank you. Back to you, Bobby.
Okay, let's go back then. So we had the presentation, the public comments. Is that everyone from public comments, or do we need to stay on that agenda item?
That should be everyone. So okay. That agenda item is taken care of.
So then we have additional presentations from clinicians. Are Dr. Matthews or Dr. Perlman on the line?
Yep, we are here.
Yep.
All right, take it away.
So first of all, this is Kathy Matthews. I'd like to thank Marcy for her very nice presentation. I mean, Jenny.
Happens all the time.
I knew I was going to do that. Jenny for her presentation. And I also wanted to thank the families for those very powerful presentations and appreciate your willingness to come on the line and tell us your stories. So I just have a couple of comments that I put together after the after the initial canceled meeting. So, and I think what's on this first slide is sort of the take-home points, and this is representing the clinical opinion of all of us who care for the children with SMA here at Iowa. And then I'll let Seth go through some comments too. But as Marcy said, type 1 SMA is uniformly fatal in infancy or requires full-time ventilation and significant medical needs. You heard that far more elegantly than I can put it by the families. The clinical diagnosis cannot be made obvious that cannot be recovered. And I think this is an important point, that by the time a patient has weakness, the only way they can have weakness is they have lost cells in their spinal cords. So by the time we make a clinical diagnosis, the disease has progressed to the point that you cannot bring back cells that are dead. So that waiting until somebody has clinical signs and symptoms, we have two risks. One is that there will be delayed diagnosis, as we heard, and number two is that you have already irretrievably lost cells that are required for motor function. And that can involve, in the type 1 babies, can involve the cells that are required for the muscles of breathing. Newborn screening is relative to, and again, the families were quite eloquent in this, relative to the economic and psychological costs of this disease. Newborn screening is inexpensive, sensitive, and specific. Treatment is highly effective when it's started before there is disease progression across all types. And that early diagnosis, we feel, would prevent morbidity and potentially mortality. Next slide. So I think I wanted to just emphasize, and Jenny said this, that the FDA did not even feel that they needed an advisory committee because the evidence for benefit in this drug was so overwhelming. And I think because treatment has been a big part of our discussions about putting SMA on newborn screening, I think it's important that we consider the fact that the FDA has done a very thorough review, and we probably, despite the expertise of everybody on this committee, we are probably not in a better position than the FDA to evaluate effectiveness. And they didn't even feel they needed an advisory committee. Next slide. This is Marcy Jenny already went through this, so I think we can skip this slide. She already said that this language is not specific to SMA, so go to the next slide.
No, wait.
Oh, wait a minute, go back, because
Jenny had pointed out that that was never said before, that they would be required to come back and report, which is not true because that's a template letter.
But no, this has to do with the only that, in fact, that it's only is a recommendation, which you also pointed out. So go on to the next slide. So that language is not specific. This is the part about long-term follow-up, the piece that the secretary said that they want long-term follow-up. And I think there was concern in some of our discussions that how would the newborn screening program implement long-term follow-up. And this is just to make the point for everybody on the phone that there are many groups in the country who are interested in the long-term follow-up of patients with SMA. And so there are national efforts through advocacy groups and clinicians to formalize the long-term follow-up. So we may not need to duplicate all of these activities. And that at least within the scope currently of newborn screening, that might be outside the scope, but I didn't think that that needed to be a deal breaker for SMA. So next slide. And I'm going very quickly through this because I think there has been a lot of this stuff already said. When the clinical team goes through the Wilson-Youngner criteria, we felt that it clearly meets the criteria for newborns, for adding SMA to newborn screening. Next slide. This just says the same thing, that we feel that it easily fulfills the criteria. And that well, and Marcy, Jenny also said this.
I'll just change my name.
That I think that it would be, given the dramatic treatment that we're seeing with this disease, I think that there is probably reason for thinking about policy going forward. I think as we look across genetic diseases, genetic gene modifying therapies, gene editing therapies are coming down the line. And perhaps there needs to be a bigger review of how newborn screening is going to address those things. But I don't think we have a policy right now. And I think it's a little unfair to not add SMA when it is in many ways meeting our criteria, because we are anticipating problems down the line. I think there's a need for perhaps developing a policy or discussion about the issue, but I don't think it should kill SMA screening now. So that's really, I think, all I had to say. I think that's my last slide. Yes. So I'd be happy to answer any questions, but I'd like to, I know Seth has some comments to share also.
I'm worried I'm going to start calling you Marcy.
Okay, that does it.
So I'm Seth Perlman. I'm the other neuromuscular pediatric specialist here. Oh, there we go. We have a name tag for Jenny.
Got a name tag.
So there's a couple of things that I just wanted to put a little attention on. One is just a little bit more detail in terms of the scientific literature background that kind of highlights for us of SMA is also a trend. So there's kind of a last minute little summary thing that Kim has put up on the screen here. But there's a few papers that I think are key ones to look at in the literature of understanding why this is so critical from our point of view as clinicians. So the second row down, the Swoboda paper, they looked at basically the timeline of loss of these anterior horn cells, the motor neurons in the spinal cord. All of us are born with all of the neurons that we're ever going to have in our spinal cords. And losing these neurons, whether it's because you have SMA or you get polio or West Nile virus or something like that, that loss of those cells is irreversible. And what they found in that study was that really the loss of these motor neurons in type 1 SMA, the most common and most severe form, starts perinatally. And the most severe denervation happens in the first few months of life. And by the time a baby with type 1 SMA is 6 months old, they've lost more than 90% of those anterior horns. And there is no way, whether we're talking about just the normal natural history of the disease or using drugs like nusinersen, or if gene therapy becomes FDA approved, none of these therapies will ever bring those cells back. And so it's critical to save those cells while a person still has them. Which brings us to the point of the diagnostic delay. So the next row down is a paper from the same year, which looked at 21 reports from the literature, basically analyzing how long does it take between when children become symptomatic with SMA and children get diagnosed. And for type 1 SMA, so the most severe form, the average age at which symptoms became clear to families and people seeing these babies was about 2.5 months. And the average age of diagnosis was nearly 6.5 months, which means that there's a 4-month delay between the symptoms and the actual confirmed diagnosis of SMA in these babies with type 1 SMA. Similar but even longer delays were seen in the milder types, type 2 and type 3. And so it's very clear that on average, we are missing these children for months. And this is a time frame in which all those anterior horn cells, they're dying off. And once they're gone, I won't talk much about the next row, the Glasscock paper. Jenny touched on that paper in her discussion, which has a consensus statement and algorithm to guide what to do in the case of positive newborn screening results and who to treat. I do make a couple of comments on the right, basically where that paper looks at some of the preclinical animal work that showed that early treatment was better than later treatment in impacting the disease course of mouse models of SMA. And they also make a couple comments about another study, the ENDEAR study. It's hard to keep all of these study names straight. The ENDEAR study looked at type 1 babies with SMA and 2 copies of SMN2, but these were all babies that already had symptoms, so this was not pre-symptomatic treatment. And the next row, the Finkel paper from last year, this actually published that phase 3 data from the ENDEAR trial. And what they found in that paper is that they saw a greater likelihood that babies treated with a shorter disease duration would respond to therapy with nusinersen than babies that had a longer disease duration. And they also found that the likelihood of babies surviving event-free, meaning not dying and not needing round-the-clock ventilatory support, was higher in infants who had a shorter disease duration at screening, meaning 13 or less weeks of disease duration than those who had a longer disease duration. And if you take that time frame of 13 weeks and you go back and look at that Lin paper, and we have an average delay of diagnosis of 4 months, that average delay is greater than the time frame in which they showed in this trial that children did worse, which is, all of this basically winds up with the fact that scientifically, in terms of both animal and human treatment trials, and the basic science, what's happening biologically, it is critical for us to identify children early and treat them early. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, besides the scientific background, we heard, really wonderful presentations from families about individual patients, but I wanted to highlight really just one patient that I encountered as a clinician, who I think exemplifies just how critical it is for us to identify these children early. There's 2 case examples in the little handout that I made here, but the first one is the one that I want to focus on. And this is a little baby boy. I first met him when he was 7 months old. He was born early. He was born at 32 weeks. And he had a few weeks that he had to stay in the neonatal ICU, needing oxygen. He did incidentally have newborn screening, which showed that he did not have CF and he didn't have sickle cell, along with the other conditions tested for by newborn screening. And he was eventually able to go home from the NICU. He had a bit of a cough when he was a month old, but that was gone in a couple of weeks. But at a 2-month well child check, they noted that he had retractions with bobbing of his head with breathing. And for those of you that don't take care of babies regularly and aren't involved on the medical treatment side, retractions means that your ribs kind of suck in with each breath. And that's a sign of a respiratory problem, either respiratory weakness or some other kind of an issue. At 2.5 months old, so 2 weeks after that well child check, he actually got admitted to the hospital for respiratory distress that kept getting worse despite the fact that he was given antibiotics for presumed infection. There was some worries about, was he swallowing okay? We had a swallow study to make sure that wasn't causing breathing problems, and that was fine. And then 2 months after that admission, so now he's 4.5 months old, he actually got admitted to our hospital. He had a bronchoscopy. That was basically a scope of down into his airways and his lungs which was done to kind of work up persistent abnormalities that were seen on a chest x-ray where he wasn't inflating some sections of his lung. And he kept having breathing problems. And eventually he made his way to his pediatrician, who sent him on to our clinic. And seeing him in our clinic, which was at 7 months old, so this is 5 months after the first sign of any kind of breathing issues, we talked to mom about what she had seen with regards to his motor functions. And she said when he was 3 months old, 4 months old, he could reach with his arms, grab at things, and he was trying to roll but could only get about halfway. And over the next month or so, he stopped doing those things. He couldn't even lift up his arms anymore, he couldn't lift up his legs, and he had no control of his head. And so when I saw him in clinic at 7 months old, we very quickly were worried about SMA as one of the most likely things to explain what we were seeing. And we sent the SMA gene testing. And we also arranged for a pulmonology appointment with one of our pulmonologists with expertise in neuromuscular causes of breathing problems. And that appointment was scheduled for 10 days later, which took a little bit of finagling and pressure. 6 days after that clinic visit, we got back the confirmatory result: this baby has SMA. He had no copies of SMN1, which is the typical gene pattern for children affected, and he had 2 copies of SMN2. And we planned he was going to be seen in a few days. We planned on sitting down with mom at that upcoming visit and telling her that result. 2 days after that gene test came back, he was brought to a local urgent care where, since the family did not yet know what his genetic diagnosis was and the physicians treating him didn't know, he was just sent home after a breathing treatment when he had presented with respiratory problems. 2 days after that visit, which was the day he was supposed to see our neuromuscular specialist pulmonologist, mom found him breathing, or not breathing, and pulseless at home. He got CPR for a long time and able to get a pulse back, but he eventually died a few days later in our ICU here. And we sat down and we ultimately had to tell mom that gene test result in the ICU when her son had effectively died. And this is a case where there's a baby with breathing problems, progressive weakness, being seen by local doctors, urgent care doctors, even a pulmonologist. And this developmental delay that we know happens resulted in this baby dying. And there are therapies even beyond nusinersen that potentially could have been mobilized. So there are pulmonary measures that we know to take in terms of treating children with neuromuscular problems that keep them alive and keep them from potentially dying from, as one mom talked about, just a disease that would have been a cold in any other child. And these things, in addition to nusinersen, are critical to mobilize as early as possible for these babies. And it's a really good example of how important it is to identify these babies before the months of delay that may happen when they're not recognized as early as possible, which would be with newborn screening. So those are the main things that I wanted to touch on in terms of scientific background and just an example case that I've seen as a clinic. I'm happy to answer any questions that people have.
Are there any questions for either of the presenters? Thank you both for sharing the information and the stories that you had as well about cases. The next presenter that we have is Dr. Travis Henry.
Hi, this is Travis. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Travis, what slides would you like me to put up, or what documents?
Would be the PDF that's spinal muscular atrophy benefit.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I have to apologize. I got a new computer yesterday afternoon, so I'm trying to get used to navigating here. So thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Kim. My intent is just to present the data which has been made available through clinical trials to be able to assess what the benefit associated with pre-symptomatic treatment with the FDA-approved nusinersen may be in the scope of newborn screening. Next slide, please, Kim. Thank you. So, of course, nusinersen clinical trial data has been collected, and of course, the phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials were in the clinical / post-symptomatic initiation of symptoms, as has been mentioned before. And those, the initial trial of CS3A, which I'll refer to a little bit later, and CS3B. And the CS3B is also known as the ENDEAR trial. Those were focused on symptoms typically within a 6-month window of time, and then treatment of nusinersen within patients who primarily had two copies of the SMN2 gene. Next slide, please. And this is some of the information that I just quickly summarized. So the CS3A was the phase 2 efficacy trial looking at nusinersen. There were at least at time of the initial analysis by the advisory committee, the Secretary's advisory committee, there were 24 months of data, 20 patients enrolled, and again, symptom onset was before 6 months of age. Loading doses are noted here on the slide, but I do want to highlight that the majority of patients in this trial had 17 of 20 subjects enrolled in the trial had 2 copies of SMN2. Next slide, please. In comparison, the CS3B trial, which is also the ENDEAR trial, which has been noted before, was a randomized trial, which was 2-to-1 treatment with nusinersen versus a sham treatment. And the primary outcomes were, again, ventilator-free survival in the motor milestones using the Hammersmith Infant Neurological Examination Index. And again, very similar to the efficacy trial, a less than or equal to 6 months of data following the first dose. There were 73 patients who provided at least 6 months of data following the first dose, with 37 on the sham treatment arm. And again, symptoms onset was prior to 6 months. And as Jenny had noted earlier, that this trial was terminated due to statistically significant increase in event-free survival, so not needing respiratory ventilation for the treatment group, for the nusinersen group. And the FDA approval was based on this study. Next slide, please. So as I referred to, the improvement motor milestones for the CS3B, as well as the upcoming NURTURE trial, which I'll present the data for, were based on the Hammersmith Infant Neurological Examination. And this is a scale which provides a grading system for achieving developmental milestones, grasping, sitting unsupported, and standing, a continuous scale that's able to be assessed using some qualitative measures. Next slide, please. What I've done here is taken the Hammersmith, the Hind-2 scores, and plot them for the 2 clinical trials. On the y-axis is the Hammersmith index, and on the x-axis is the time that subjects have enrolled in the trial. And the initial CS3A trial is in the darker blue. I apologize for the colors. So it's it's that line which shows nearly 2 years worth of data. And you can see that they achieve a Hammersmith index of approximately 11 to 12, which is equivalent to sitting unsupported. And again, all participants in this trial were able to achieve sitting unsupported. And I also want to compare, I'll move to on the same slide, I'm sorry, the CS3B trial, which is in the lighter blue. And that achievement of motor milestones is very much equivalent to that of the CS3A trial, the smaller trial. But what comparatively is shown below in the purple line is the sham treatment. So these are the patients who, as has been indicated with the known history of this disease, require intervention using respirator at a minimum, and typically there is significant mortality obviously associated with SMA. Comparatively, the green line shows normal developmental milestones for quote unquote normal normal children without any sort of known disease burden. So this is what the green line is, what normal developmental milestones should look like. Next slide, please, Kim. So the NURTURE trial was the pre-symptomatic treatment. Again, the CS3A and 3B, or the ENDEAR trials, were post-onset of symptoms, a minimum of 6 months. So the NURTURE trial is pre-symptomatic treatment, which with infantile onset, known type 1 SMA. So this NURTURE trial presents data which would be most similar to data that we could anticipate would provide us with outcomes data should we screen for SMA patients in the newborn period. And again, the primary endpoint measures within the NURTURE trial are nearly identical to the ENDEAR trial, the smaller trial with the ventilator-free survival being the primary endpoint measure, and the secondary outcome being the motor milestones, again, as rated by the Hein to Hammersmith neurological scale. So enrollment is less than or equal to 1 month of age. Again, it's already known that this is prior to symptom onset. And within those patients which had been enrolled at the time of the publication of this data, there were 17 patients enrolled, and 12 of those 17 had 2 copies of SMN2. Next slide, please, Kim. This is the poster presentation, which was made by the principal investigators for the coordinating site for the NURTURE data, for the NURTURE study. Again, at the time of the presentation of this data, there were 9 patients who had accumulated 1 year of treatment data with nusinersen. And on this, yeah, I apologize, it is a bit small. What this slide shows, at least in the bottom portion, is the range of Hammersmith scores, and then an associated column with the copy number of SMN2. And I'm highlighting again the copy number of SMN2 simply to show that there may be some differential response to treatment within SMN2 or SMN3 copy numbers. And that follows again with some of the underlying mechanisms associated with how nusinersen works. Next slide, please, Kim. Sorry, thank you, Kim. And what I've done here is basically add on the NURTURE trial onto the previous graph that I had presented. So the CS3A and 3B data is shown as comparison for what could be anticipated for response to nusinersen treatment in the clinical setting, meaning detection within 6 months of symptom onset. In comparison, on this slide, I've shown the response to nusinersen treatment in the pre-symptomatic trial for those patients with 2 copies of SMN2. And there's a differential response to treatment within these patients with 2 copies of SMN2. On the orange dotted line, those are patients, 3 patients, again, with 2 copies of SMN2. And at the approximate 1 year study interim analysis, they've achieved a Hammersmith score of 12, which again equates to sitting unsupported. Comparatively, the 1 year time point for the CS3B ENDEAR trial is much lower. However, when you compare to longer term intervention or treatment with nusinersen, to me, there's a question about what the anticipated outcome for, at least in this specific group of pre-symptomatic patients with 2 copies of SMN2, what their outcomes may be long term. That being said, an additional question is raised because there are 3 more patients with 2 copies of SMN2 who are able to achieve greater motor milestones than within the same study, a group of patients with the same number of SMN2 copies, which is 2. So the purple and bluish lines above the orange graph represent, the orange line represent those motor milestones reached by patients treated pre-symptomatically with 2 copies of SMN2. And these patients are able to achieve standing or walking. Next slide, please, Kim. And this slide adds on a line which indicates those 3 patients, and again, we're talking about 9 patients total in the NURTURE trial, the pre-symptomatic trial with a minimum of 1 year of data available on treatment. And the red line indicates those 3 patients with 3 copies of SMN2 and their motor milestones that were able to be achieved. And all 3 of these patients with 3 copies of SMN2 were able to achieve standing or walking. Next slide, please, Kim. And I do want to highlight again the SMN2 copy number distribution, which is provided by a number of collated studies across international as well, to give some sort of a sense of what the expectation might be for detection of type 1 and type 2 SMA, in fact, all types of SMA, and what the associated relative copy numbers may be for SMN2 within those categories. As you can see, the very large majority of type 1 SMA have 2 copies of SMN2, which is what Jenny had pointed out earlier. And then the expectation that perhaps maybe 20% of the SMA patients may have 3 copies of SMN2. Next slide, please, Kim. So my question, I guess, is does pre-symptomatic treatment, newborn screening, and that's looking at the NURTURE trial, which is pre-symptomatic. So that's the closest model and the closest data available at this time as to what outcomes we might expect with newborn screening. And does that provide improved outcomes as compared to the clinical detection or post-symptomatic, which would be represented by the CS3A and CS3B or ENDEAR trials? So if you look at the short-term and long-term motor milestones accomplished by these 2 trials, pre-symptomatic, at least at 2 years, those subjects are able to achieve sitting without support at 2 years. The NURTURE trial, again, all patients are also able to accomplish sitting without support. However, there are additional patients able to achieve greater motor milestones. But again, based on SMN2 copy number, those motor milestone achievements are mixed. Next slide, please, Kim. And again, this slide was just to, again, refresh that picture that, again, the pre-symptomatic treatment and what can be expected in terms of motor milestone achievements, sitting without support, versus the pre-symptomatic treatment, and what is the impact of SMN2 copy number upon the response to treatment. Next slide, please, Kim. And I want to be as clear as I can to say that my intent in presenting this data is not to say we should or should not screen for SMA. That is absolutely not what I'm trying to do by presenting this data. What I'm trying to do by presenting this data is to present all the available data that we have at this time. And I guess to weigh within the respective committee, is this data sufficient to be able to determine benefit for pre-symptomatic treatment versus the clinical data for post-symptomatic treatment that we have at this time. And it has been announced by the NURTURE trial that interim analysis is available. However, that statement has been released, but no additional data for interim analysis has been released at this time. And that statement was made, I believe, in June of this year. To me, this, again, the data in terms of trying to assess benefit for pre-symptomatic treatment, it's difficult to assess benefit at this time because of the limited data associated with the NURTURE trial. And again, I absolutely want to say that I'm not trying to say we should not screen for SMA. It's my intent to say that due to limited data, it's difficult to determine benefit associated with pre-symptomatic treatment, and perhaps delaying the proposal to have Cidac vote would be prudent, so that more data would be made available from the NURTURE trial. And I'll take any questions that attendees may have.
Not hearing any questions. Thank you, Dr. Henry.
Thank you.
Actually, I do. This is
Go ahead.
Sorry. Travis, I'm want to make a comment, then I have a question. So I serve on FDA panels for neurologic diseases, and I've served on drug approval panels for these, and we've looked at many results from clinical trials, and we have very spirited discussions. These are national meetings that get a lot of press coverage and a lot of parent involvement. And Kathy Matthews, or maybe she goes by Matthews Kathy now, you know, is familiar with these. These were on the ones I've been on most recently are the ones with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And what I want to point out is that these panels and the FDA we do a tremendous amount of review of these data. And in the most recent one we did, the panel, in the end, the majority of the votes were to say we couldn't approve the drug because the controlled trials or the data were minimal, yet this drug is doing some wonderful things for DMD, and fortunately, there was an opportunity for FDA and the drug company to come together and get this approved. But so the point I want to make is yes, maybe the data are sparse right now, but it doesn't mean it's the state of the science or will be the state of the science. And so to me, I'm just not seeing a reason to delay this. And then the question I have for you, Travis, and maybe it's for the hygienic lab in general. My understanding is in newborn screening, your role is to develop these tests, make sure they're valid, make sure you get valid clinical results back. What you're referring to is more about clinical care and milestones, and I'm just puzzled. How does that figure in to the role you have in this testing?
Very good question, Paul. So I guess in comment to your first comment about the work that FDA does, absolutely agree. There's a large amount of data review that goes into the process that FDA does. That being said, I do see a slightly different wrinkle for applying an FDA approval for a drug in the clinical setting versus potentially applying that drug into a mandated program for newborn screening under state responsibility. And your second question, I guess, kind of ties on to the last comment about mandated state newborn screening. Yes, I am a member of the state hygienic laboratory, and my responsibilities are in test development and validation. That being said, I guess I feel I also have a role and a duty to the program, the Iowa Newborn Screening Program, for which I'm a contractor. So I guess I should say that I should have provided perhaps a conflict of interest disclosure at the beginning of my statement, saying that my statements may not be those of the Iowa Newborn Screening Program. So I guess I'm presenting my statements to look at the impact of newborn screening, treatment outcomes, and perhaps a programmatic view with response to the issue of state-mandated newborn screening.
Okay. All right, that's helpful. So I got a follow-up question that there are states who are testing for newborn screening disorders that have no treatment or very little tested treatment, CRAB-A, to my knowledge, being one of them, yet there's a fair amount of energies. So I still question the need for, whether it's your personal views or the hygienic lab views, I still question the need to question these data when there is a treatment. Maybe we don't know the full story of the pre-symptomatic benefits of it yet, but we are seeing results of post-symptomatic benefits, and also there are some suggestions that say maybe there are some pre-symptomatic benefits, but we've heard some very eloquent discussions by parents whose lives and their children's lives would have seemed like they would be dramatically changed if this knowledge was available. And in addition, the example presented by Seth for earlier testing for the patient who died in the PICU. So I guess from my view, and you know, Travis, we can have our discussions offline, but I guess given nearly a unanimous vote on the screening committee, given my experience in reviewing data and doing drug approvals for FDA, and giving the infancy and pun intended where these trials are for this drug compared to the cost of screening for diseases we don't have treatments for, I support, and I think that we should move this forward for approval and integration into newborn screening.
Well, I'll be very quick. I think, Paul, the words you used in terms of the data available and may or may not suggest treatment in the pre-symptomatic. I mean, for me, that's the key, because at this time, and again, I disclaimer, I'm a contractor for the state. I am not a decision maker for the Iowa newborn screening program. But the suggestion of we may or may not have the data, to me, again, highlights the importance of being able to address questions that take into account the benefit for all of Iowa's citizens. I in no means want to detract from the clinical perspective, or surely by no means the parents' perspective. But I think there also is a recognition that we need to keep in mind the public health impact and all the other citizens for Iowa for which there are services provided.
So this is Seth Perlman. I have a comment. Mostly, I just want to reiterate, Travis, you do a great job of talking about some of the pitfalls of the limitation on nurture data. I think what is important to keep in mind is that there is also longer follow-up and a greater patient number presented and published in the ADHERE data that demonstrates that there is a difference in the time frame in which treatment is started for these babies. So there's pre-symptomatic, but then how early after the development of symptoms treatment is started clearly makes a difference also. And it's clear from individual patient examples and from published literature, summarizing what's in the literature, that there is an unacceptable delay in identifying these babies and diagnosing them. And seeing both the small number in the nurture trial, but also what they're presenting in the ADHERE trial, I just want to emphasize there's more than just the one small sample size showing that timing makes a difference in terms of starting therapy.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And the reason why I showed the CS3A trial, the 2-year trial, was to again compare that the timing in terms of how when treatment is initiated, and again the data provided by the ADHERE trial, the publication which you stated, and then them looking at the difference of 13 months earlier, the ability to deliver a diagnosis, 13 weeks earlier as compared to the typical course. Again, 13 weeks is again approximately 3 months or so. And then looking at the trial data in terms of the range of patients enrolled into the trial and what that range of data was for symptom onset, certainly that 3 month fits within that range of data which is included in the CS3A trial. And when I look at also the outcome data associated with the CS3A trial, which is longer, I guess to me there still is that question that, again, if the outcome data for pre-symptomatic versus post-symptomatic are nearly equivalent, at least when referring to that one subgroup with SMN2 copy numbers, I guess to me, again, that questions whether an earlier, it provides a question. I'm not saying whether this is written in stone by any means, but to me it provides a question as to whether that difference in diagnostic delay actually does have an impact on outcomes.
This is Ashley Comer, and I have a question about what would be the next steps after a kid would screen positive if it was added on newborn screening. I would assume they'd get referred to clinic and then have some additional testing to determine SMN2 copy numbers to try to figure out treatment. And what would be the time frame for all of that before a kid would be able to have treatment?
Christina, can you answer that?
Ashley.
This is Christina.
Ashley, this is Piper. This is Piper. I think this might be addressed when I talk about the next steps. So the next steps for SMA. So the idea is to have the advisory committee members hear this presentation and receive information about SMA.
Yeah,
and then
Kim, the question was about clinical management. The question was about clinical management. It's Amy.
She's
okay. Sorry. Okay. Excuse me.
That cuts off.
Yeah.
Question, bye.
So what we will do is we'll have at the October meeting. Sorry, I lost track. At the October meeting, we will ask the committee members, the Cidac committee members, to vote on whether or not to request a formal proposal to be presented to the committee in early 2019. And the formal proposal will contain recommended care path, if you will. After this, it will contain information about the costs, projected costs of newborn screening, and the clinical flow. It will talk about the expertise available for treatment, the referral patterns, and that type of stuff. So that the formal proposal will get a little more into the weeds, and would be expected to provide the information that you asked about, Ashley. So if we identify a child through newborn screening with SMA, then what happens next? So that formal proposal would be presented then to Cidac at the beginning of 2019 at their meeting, and that at that time they would we would ask that Cidac vote to approve a pilot for SMA, pilot testing program.
This is Christina Trout, and I wanted to follow up on what I think the specific question was, which we can, based on what we know about the newborn screening current activities for other conditions, is that once the screen is positive, the primary care physician is notified, and within a day or two, the patient who screens positive for SMA would be referred to the neuromuscular clinic, where confirmatory diagnostic testing would be done. At this time, diagnostic testing can be completed typically within 24 to 48 hours through laboratories that do stat testing for newborns. And the family would have access to a neuromuscular specialist within a matter of days. So from the timeline of screening positive, we would anticipate a 5-day course of diagnosis, 5 to 7 days, for them to be referred in, get genetic testing underway that confirms and clarifies the SMN2 copy number. And then that would help to assess the urgency of the referral, whether or not they have 2, 3, or 4 copies of SMN2. And then a clinical pathway would be set for each individual family about how their clinical care would look from then on. That would also allow the other healthcare interventions that include pulmonary management, nutrition management, and all of the other activities that might have to do with critical care needs that would be happening would be addressed.
How long does it take to get the med?
The medication is available within 24 hours. If we make a request, it can be FedExed overnight. And typically our clinicians are in clinic Monday through Friday, and in emergency situations, we would be able to give the drug fairly immediately, but typically we do these every Friday. And if there's a holiday, we make arrangements to either do it the day before the holiday or the Monday following.
And this is Piper, and just to clarify, this speaks to our Stellar program in Iowa at UAHC, the neuromuscular program. This wouldn't apply, or we can't speak to what the process would be and the timing would be for, say, Children's in Omaha or our neighboring states. if those clients end up going there.
I would like to clarify on that. I think that that's also discussed with every other thing that's screened for, that the clients are given the opportunity for where they'd like to seek their care, and generally that includes a discussion about how quickly they could be seen at those other places.
Yes, definitely. Not debating that point. Yep. I think that's all that we have, unless anybody else has any other comments that they'd like to make.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, this is Stan Burbrick from the State Hygienic Laboratory. And just want to clarify a little bit on the part of the hygienic laboratory. What we're talking about is adding a new condition to a mandated screening panel. And the role of the hygienic laboratory, in addition to being designated as a central screening laboratory, it also has a responsibility as part of the public health system to ensure that the programs that are put in place and those decisions that are put in place are in fact in support of that responsibility that the public health programs have, the state has, in mandating screening for a condition. And so and among those things is to assure that the certainty of benefit is known. And I think that's one of the issues that, as we continue forward to present a full discussion of this, is a recognition, and I encourage everyone to go and actually to look at the Secretary's Advisory Committee's website. They actually have posted all of the information and even transcripts in the webinar of their meetings. But posted there is the evidence review report that was performed by the Secretary's Advisory Committee. And to review that, because the data that was available to them at that time, and again, I don't know how much of that has changed, but was recognized that there was little published data for this, and that they actually had to create models based on the limited data they had to kind of project of what it might be if we had more data. And so the classification of the certainty of benefit was actually moderate. And if you look at the matrix that was established by that committee on how to make decisions on whether to recommend a condition be added, the moderate certainty of benefit that they as a that's in this evidence review document revealed, and the committee determined that it was moderate certainty. In that matrix, you'll notice that there is no assessment of the feasibility by the state to provide that testing, because it was understood that unless you had a certainty of benefit that was high, it shouldn't even be considered to go to screening. So I think it is important to take a look at the information that was provided by them, and to realize that at the state level, we have the responsibility to assure that this is actually being done and provides known benefit with understood harms, and I think that's important to be brought out to the table, is that the state has responsibility in mandating something on its population, that the benefit is known and is high significance.
This is Seth Perlman. Again, I think that's a really great point to make, Stan. That data and that sort of summary outlook on things is available for everyone to review. From my own perspective, after all of that analysis was done on that end, I'm in favor of recommending that it be included. I think that says a lot, despite some of the concerns that are raised about length of follow-up of that data and what the quality of that data may or may not be.
Just to follow up, this is Stan again, just to follow up with that, I think it needs to be recognized too that as you go through that information, you'll see that they actually identify certain things that they are not addressing, that they do not, in fact, consider the overall cost of implementing this testing. All they considered was how much does the test cost, the assay that would be required to screen. So there's a number of issues that they actually don't include in their assessment of whether it should be added to a mandated screening panel or not. And at the state level, I think those are things we must consider.
So this is Hannah Bombi, and first of all, I would just like to thank all of the presenters that came today and provided all of the information. This was very helpful. I also just wanted to make the comment that having been a voting member a couple of years ago when we discussed Pompeii, I feel personally that this is really helpful to have this type of a meeting prior to asking for a vote. So that the voting members have a chance to really digest all of this information and perhaps ask additional questions that may come up prior to the October meeting. So with that being said, Piper, if voting members do have additional questions, should we send those to you and you will disperse them appropriately, or what would you recommend?
Yeah, if there are additional questions, please send them to me. Shoot me an email with those, and I will send them to the appropriate experts or the appropriate person to address those questions. And then I will distribute the question and the response out to the entire committee.
Kim, yeah, I would, since we probably have different responses depending on which expert you ask, I would ask that if you're going to ask one expert their opinion, that you ask the other experts about their opinion, because I'm concerned that there's a slant to how you view the information. And before information is disseminated widely to people that are voting, I think everyone should have the information to have a comment on someone's question, to give input.
I will make sure that the people that I request feedback from or response from are the appropriate people.
I'd also be worried that some of us would call Jenny Jenny and some of us might call her Marcy. Which probably also should include multiple people.
That's what happens when you have two first names.
I'm not the only.
You and George Mike.
Yeah. Travis Henry.
Oh, there you go.
Piper, yeah.
We are among you.
Okay, I think that's it, Bobby.
Oh, Kim, I do have one more question. When is the vote, when is the discussion going to be added to the next agenda that was missing from the July vote regarding the samples that were to be collected for the last many months to standardize testing? There was an IRB approval pending. Cidac.
Yeah, that's on the next. That will be on the October meeting.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
I don't know how to turn this all off.